January 12, 1910. A pale winter sun crept over the rooftops of a small American town, its cold light softening the rough edges of wooden porches and narrow, snow-lined streets. Frost clung to window frames as kitchen stoves crackled awake, sending thin streams of heat into rooms still chilled from the night. A lone wagon rolled across frozen ground, its wheels grinding against patches of ice that horses struggled to navigate. Farther down the road, an early automobile shuddered to life, its exhaust drifting upward in clumsy bursts that startled the usual morning quiet. Newspapers rested on doorsteps, thin pages carrying stories of new machines, growing cities, and distant uncertainties that most households had only begun to understand. The day felt familiar yet faintly changed, as if the country itself was inhaling before a long decade of transformation that would reshape ordinary life more than anyone imagined. Daily life across the nation carried the texture of a society caught between generations. Rural families woke before sunrise, stepping into fields that demanded physical endurance and an understanding of seasonal rhythms inherited from grandparents. Their routines remained rooted in nature, milking cows before breakfast, repairing fences, tending to livestock, preparing simple meals from scratch. The landscape felt steady and predictable, even as whispers of modern conveniences drifted from nearby towns. Farmers read articles about electric pumps, gasoline tractors, and grain separators, but many still trusted the reliability of mules, hand tools, and familiar techniques that had carried them through harsh winters and bountiful harvests. This gradual pull toward modernization shaped the quiet tension of the era, as people wondered how much of the old world could survive in the face of mechanical progress. Cities told a different story. Streets bustled before most rural families had finished morning chores, with electric streetcars rumbling past rows of factories that dominated industrial districts. The smell of coal dust blended with steam from laundries, bakeries, and machine shops, filling the air with a sense of movement and possibility. Immigrants from Europe added new textures to neighborhoods, languages, cultural customs, and foods shaping urban identity block by block. Tenement buildings stood tightly packed, their rooms small and crowded, lit by single bulbs that flickered when the city's power supply strained. Yet many urban families accepted these cramped conditions as temporary stepping stones toward a better life, saving wages from long workdays to secure more stable housing or opportunities for their children. Cities felt loud and restless, propelled by the promise of economic growth that attracted workers from every direction. Factories echoed with the rhythm of the modern world taking shape. Long rows of machines filled cavernous rooms built of brick, steel, and glass, where workers stood shoulder to shoulder performing repetitive tasks that became muscle memory. The introduction of moving assembly lines in the early 1910s increased production speed dramatically, turning manufacturing into a precise and demanding system that required strict coordination. Reports noted the physical strain of the work, aching backs, swollen hands, and exhaustion that followed workers home each night. Yet these jobs, often paying modest but steady wages, offered stability during a period of rapid industrial expansion. Families depended on them, even as debates intensified about safety regulations, fair wages, and humane working hours. The factory floor symbolized both the promise and the cost of American progress. Transportation illustrated the shift between past and future more clearly than almost anything else in the decade. Horses still lined city streets, pulling trolleys and delivery wagons, their hooves clattering against cobblestones that had supported countless generations. But alongside them, early automobiles rattled through intersections, driven by businessmen, doctors, and adventurous families who embraced the excitement of personal motor travel. Gasoline stations were rare and often improvised, sometimes no more than a pump beside a general store. Rural roads were rough, dusty in dry seasons, and nearly impassable after rain. Even so, automobility signaled a new freedom, allowing people to travel farther, faster, and with greater independence than ever before. The contrast between horse-drawn wagons and Model T Fords became one of the clearest symbols of a nation at the threshold of modern life. Ordinary households reflected the decade's uneven transition. In many homes, kerosene lamps still lit evening hours, their warm glow illuminating kitchens where families gathered after long workdays. Others had recently installed electric bulbs, marveling at the steady light that required no matches, trimming, or fuel. Coal stoves remained central to daily living, providing heat for cooking, bathing, and warming rooms during cold months. Women carried much of the domestic burden, washing clothes by hand, preserving food, sewing garments, and caring for children with limited medical knowledge or support. Household manuals offered guidance on hygiene, nutrition, and modern cleaning techniques, signaling a cultural push towards scientific home management. These responsibilities anchored family life, shaping the rhythms of each day with routines passed down through generations. Children of the 1910s experienced a childhood that blended strict expectations with newfound educational ideals. Many rural children contributed to chores from an early age, feeding animals, fetching water, collecting firewood, or helping in fields during planting and harvest. In towns and cities, school attendance increased steadily as reforms emphasized literacy, hygiene, and civic responsibility. Classrooms often held multiple grade levels in a single room, disciplined by teachers who balanced instruction with daily challenges of limited supplies and overcrowding. Outside school, children played simple games, marbles, jump rope, stickball, and crafted entertainment from imagination rather than organized programs. Despite these simple pleasures, childhood was shaped by economic necessity, with many young people taking small jobs to help families meet rising living costs. Food traditions mirrored both regional identity and the availability of modern conveniences. Rural families relied on gardens, home-cured meats, and seasonal produce stored in cellars through cold months. In urban neighborhoods, bakeries, butcher shops, and street vendors offered a variety of affordable options for families lacking space to grow their own food. Canned goods became increasingly common, providing quick meals that required fewer hours of preparation than traditional recipes. Cookbooks published during the decade emphasized practicality, nutrition, and cleanliness, reflecting a growing awareness of health and science. Meals were central to family unity, creating moments of connection that counterbalanced long workdays and the fast pace of urban life. Through food, communities preserved cultural heritage while adapting to the modern world's changing expectations. Entertainment evolved rapidly as technology reshaped how Americans spent their free time. Vaudeville theaters remained popular, offering variety shows that mixed comedy, music, dance, and novelty acts. Nickelodeon's small, inexpensive movie theaters introduced audiences to silent films that portrayed adventure, romance, and faraway places with unprecedented visual storytelling. Phonographs brought recorded music into homes, transforming evenings with new sounds that appealed especially to the younger generation. Community events, church socials, and town gatherings continued to anchor social life, maintaining traditions that had long supported a sense of belonging. People found joy in these gatherings, embracing them as brief escapes from the seriousness of work and the uncertainties of a rapidly changing world. Medical knowledge was advancing, yet healthcare access remained uneven across the nation. Physicians relied on a mix of modern techniques and long-established practices, traveling long distances in rural regions to treat everything from infections to injuries. Hospitals grew in size and number, particularly in urban centers, though many families still preferred home care due to cost or cultural custom. Public health campaigns promoted sanitation, vaccination, and disease prevention, responding to outbreaks of influenza, tuberculosis, and other illnesses that affected communities with little warning. These efforts reflected a growing belief in scientific progress, even as the decade exposed the limits of available treatments. Health remained a daily concern, influencing everything from household cleanliness to community planning. Communication changed the tempo of life as telephones became more accessible, though still limited in rural regions. Switchboard operators connected calls manually, making human labor essential to the expanding network. Families who acquired telephones described the novelty of hearing distant voices instantly, a sense of connection that reshaped social expectations. Newspapers remained the most influential source of information, delivering daily updates on politics, technological innovation, and international events. Their impact was immense, shaping public opinion and guiding household discussions. Letters continued as a cherished form of communication, carrying emotions and personal stories across miles with a sense of intimacy that new technologies had not yet replaced. America's cultural landscape broadened as immigration continued at a significant pace during the early part of the decade. Millions arrived from Europe, passing through ports like Ellis Island, where inspectors processed travelers seeking opportunity, refuge, or reunion with family. Newcomers infused communities with traditions, languages, and skills that enriched the nation's fabric. At the same time, Tensions emerged as debates over labor competition, housing shortages, and cultural differences intensified in crowded cities. These dynamics reflected the challenges of integrating diverse populations during a time of rapid growth, shaping social policies and attitudes for generations. Despite disagreements, immigration remained a defining force, fueling the workforce that supported the nation's industrial rise. Agriculture also faced pressures as modern technology transformed farming methods. Tractors, mechanical harvesters, and gas-powered plows promised increased productivity, but many farmers hesitated to invest due to cost or skepticism about reliability. Crop prices fluctuated unpredictably, creating financial strain for families dependent on seasonal income. Agricultural bulletins and university research stations offered advice on soil management, pest control, and crop rotation, signaling a new push towards scientific farming. These developments gradually changed expectations about what farming could achieve, though the transition was slow and varied across regions. The rural landscape remained centered on hard work, strong family ties, and resilience built from generations of adapting to natural cycles. Social norms reflected a complex blend of tradition and emerging modern ideas. Women carried central responsibilities within households, yet increasing numbers pursued education, employment, and public engagement beyond domestic roles. The women's suffrage movement gained momentum throughout the 1910s, fueled by organized campaigns, public demonstrations, and strategic advocacy that challenged long-standing assumptions about gender and citizenship. Their efforts reflected broader shifts in national values, as Americans reevaluated the meaning of democracy and civic participation during a period marked by social and technological upheaval. Communities navigated these conversations carefully, often balancing respect for tradition with growing recognition of societal change. Religion remained a vital force, guiding moral outlooks and shaping community life. Churches served as social hubs, offering gatherings, charitable work, and education alongside spiritual guidance. Sermons addressed topics ranging from family values to social responsibility, reflecting widespread concerns about industrialization, urban life, and cultural transformation. Religious organizations spearheaded efforts to support immigrants, combat poverty, and promote temperance, emphasizing moral discipline and community cohesion. These institutions provided stability during a decade when many Americans felt uncertain about the rapid shifts surrounding them. Faith offered a sense of continuity, grounding families in beliefs that stretched back generations. Recreation reflected the growing importance of leisure in American culture. Parks and public spaces offered relief from crowded city districts, providing areas for fresh air, exercise, and family outings. Baseball grew into a national pastime, drawing enthusiastic crowds to local fields and major league stadiums. Outdoor activities such as fishing, picnicking, and bicycling remained popular, especially among those seeking inexpensive and accessible forms of enjoyment. These pastimes highlighted the importance of balance in daily life, offering respite from work while strengthening social bonds. Leisure was becoming recognized not as indulgence, but as a necessary component of well-being in an increasingly demanding society. The closing years of the decade brought global events that tested the nation's resilience. Though America initially maintained a stance of neutrality, reports from overseas documented escalating tensions and growing conflict that drew widespread concern. Families read about battles, political alliances, and humanitarian crises, wondering how distant events might shape their own futures. When the United States eventually entered the conflict, life at home shifted dramatically. Factories retooled production, communities organized support efforts, and families navigated the uncertainties of wartime separation. These experiences revealed the interconnected nature of modern society, demonstrating how global events could alter everyday life swiftly and profoundly. Even amid uncertainty, Americans continued to build lives defined by routine, perseverance, and hope. The decade demanded flexibility as traditional practices encountered new expectations shaped by industry, science, and global awareness. Families adapted by blending familiar customs with emerging innovations, creating a uniquely American experience grounded in both heritage and progress. Daily life unfolded in small moments: shared meals, quiet evenings, conversations on porches, and long days of labor, threaded together by a sense of determination that carried people through rapid change. These lived experiences formed the foundation of a nation stepping confidently, though cautiously, into the modern world. The story of the 1910s is ultimately a story of transformation measured not only in national headlines, but in the routines of ordinary people whose resilience shaped the path forward. Their days reflected the challenges and possibilities of an era defined by shifting boundaries between tradition and modernity. And as the decade drew to a close, those who had lived through its trials and triumphs stood at the threshold of a new chapter, uncertain of what lay ahead, but strengthened by the experiences that had shaped their everyday lives. The year 1914 arrived quietly in many American towns, yet the world beyond the oceans was erupting. News of conflict in Europe reached city streets and rural kitchens alike, carried by newspapers, letters, and word of mouth. Factories hummed with the familiar rhythm of machines, but conversations now included speculation about the scale of the war and what it might mean for the United States. Families watched as sons and brothers debated enlistment, while newspapers described battles in France and Belgium with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Even distant events began shaping daily choices. Households stocked extra supplies, communities held fundraisers, and discussions about preparedness seeped into schoolrooms and workplaces. The rhythm of life remained, but a shadow of global change pressed against the familiar patterns of everyday existence. By 1915, the influence of technology had begun to accelerate, reshaping both work and leisure. Automobiles became more reliable and slightly more affordable, though roads remained uneven and rural access limited. Electric streetcars and subways continued to expand in cities, shortening commutes and opening new neighborhoods for settlement. Factories incorporated more mechanized tools, increasing output while demanding sharper focus from workers. In homes, the spread of electricity brought radios into select households, allowing families to hear music and news broadcast from distant cities. Children listened with fascination, hearing the world beyond their towns for the first time, while parents debated whether these new inventions threatened or enriched their traditional ways of life. Life, even in its routine moments, was increasingly intertwined with modern innovation. The war in Europe, though initially distant, began influencing American industry by 1916. Factories received contracts to supply materials and equipment for nations already involved in the conflict, and workers adjusted to new schedules, longer hours, and unfamiliar products. Labor strikes persisted, reflecting tensions between employers seeking efficiency and employees demanding fair treatment. Newspapers chronicled both the triumphs and struggles of this workforce, portraying laborers as both engines of progress and as people vulnerable to exhaustion and injustice. Families at home managed tighter budgets, balancing rising costs of goods with the need to support children's education and household maintenance. The pulse of the nation's daily life was steady, yet tinged with an awareness of distant turmoil that could alter everything. Rural America experienced subtler shifts, yet no less significant. Farmers watched commodity prices fluctuate with international demand, sending waves of hope or anxiety through small towns. Crops were planted and harvested according to weather and market signals rather than simple tradition alone. Machinery like tractors and mechanized threshers began to appear on larger farms, signaling a future that would reduce dependence on hand labor. At the same time, many families still relied on horse-drawn equipment and manual methods, bridging generations of practice with the promise of efficiency. Social life remained community-centered. Barn raisings, church socials, and local fairs continued to structure the year, allowing neighbors to gather, exchange news, and maintain social cohesion despite economic pressures and technological changes. Children's daily experience reflected both continuity and novelty. Schoolhouses adopted standardized curricula, teaching arithmetic, reading, history, and civics with increasing attention to hygiene and physical education. Urban classrooms often held dozens of students in a single room, with teachers navigating multiple grade levels simultaneously. Outside school, children explored new forms of recreation influenced by modernity. Playgrounds, organized sports, and bicycles provided greater freedom of movement. Games and hobbies still drew from traditional pastimes, marbles, hopscotch, and handcrafted toys, but also began to embrace manufactured goods from city shops. These experiences shaped a generation aware of both the comfort of tradition and the possibilities of change. Domestic life continued to rely heavily on the work of women, yet the decade pushed boundaries of gender expectation. Many women managed households with remarkable efficiency, juggling chores, childcare, and in some cases, paid work outside the home. Cookbooks and household manuals advocated scientific approaches to cleaning, nutrition, and childcare, reflecting a growing cultural emphasis on knowledge and rationality. Women organized social clubs, charity efforts, and civic associations that subtly altered their public presence. The suffrage movement advanced steadily, encouraging political activism that would culminate in the 19th Amendment's passage in 1920. These efforts infused everyday life with new dimensions of social engagement, signaling that the domestic sphere was not the limit of influence for American women. Food remained central to rhythm and routine, shaped by both local agriculture and emerging technologies. Rural households preserved meats and vegetables, relying on root cellars, smokehouses, and iceboxes to maintain supplies through winter. In cities, families purchased more prepared or canned foods, while home gardens supplemented daily meals. Markets and corner stores provided staples, yet affordability and quality varied widely, forcing many to budget carefully. Recipes reflected a mixture of tradition and adaptation, with guidance in newspapers and magazines offering practical instruction for busy households. Meals remained moments of gathering and reflection, grounding families in continuity even as the broader world grew uncertain and unpredictable. Entertainment continued to evolve, offering brief respite from work and worry. Silent films captivated audiences in Nickelodeons, their narratives conveyed through expressive acting and intertitles that allowed viewers of all backgrounds to follow the story. Vaudeville remained popular, combining music, comedy, and novelty acts into evening spectacles. Phonographs, with their rotating discs, brought familiar songs into homes, connecting families through shared soundscapes. Sports became increasingly organized, with baseball, boxing, and horse racing drawing public attention and enthusiasm. These activities provided distraction and pleasure, yet also reflected the nation's growing appetite for communal experience and collective identity. The influenza epidemic of 1918 brought sudden and profound disruption. Communities witnessed illness spread with terrifying speed, hospitals overflowed, and ordinary routines were interrupted. Families faced sickness and death with limited medical knowledge, while public health authorities advocated quarantines, isolation, and hygiene measures. Work and school schedules shifted as cities and towns struggled to contain the virus. Despite fear and hardship, Americans adapted, relying on community networks for support. Churches, charitable organizations, and neighbors stepped in to care for the sick and bereaved. This crisis underscored the fragility of daily life and the resilience required to sustain ordinary routines in extraordinary circumstances. World War I's eventual entry in 1917 brought dramatic changes to domestic life. Young men enlisted and left families behind, creating labor shortages that altered industry, agriculture, and urban work. Women stepped into new roles, operating machinery, managing offices, and contributing to war-related production. Rationing, price controls, and patriotic campaigns reshaped shopping and meal preparation, while newspapers emphasized national unity and civic responsibility. Community organizations coordinated relief efforts, fundraising, and support for soldiers, families, turning ordinary citizens into active participants in the wartime economy. Life adapted quickly, yet preserved familiar structures of neighborhood, family, and ritual even as uncertainty reigned. The war also accelerated technological and social change. Factories implemented assembly line methods for military production, honing skills that would later influence civilian manufacturing. Transportation networks expanded to move goods and personnel efficiently. Urban centers swelled as workers followed new opportunities, while rural communities adjusted to shortages and altered agricultural priorities. News coverage heightened awareness of both national and global events, fostering a sense of connectedness that transcended local boundaries. Americans experienced firsthand how a world conflict could ripple into everyday life, influencing work, family, and personal routines with unprecedented immediacy. Social norms continued to shift amid these pressures. Women's suffrage advanced, fueled by their indispensable contributions to wartime work and civic engagement. Discussions about labor rights intensified as unions negotiated better conditions, and strikes occasionally halted production to demand fairness. Cultural life embraced both continuity and innovation. Traditional holidays and celebrations remained, while new forms of music, literature, and visual art reflected the influences of an industrial, modernized society. Even amidst challenge, Americans sought pleasure and expression, finding ways to sustain hope and connection despite upheaval. Religion retained a central role, providing moral guidance, comfort, and structure. Sermons addressed contemporary anxieties, urging both personal responsibility and collective care. Churches sponsored charitable programs to assist families affected by war, illness, or economic instability. Communities relied on these institutions not merely for spiritual guidance, but for practical assistance, reinforcing networks of trust and cooperation that stabilized everyday life. Faith shaped both private and public behavior, blending tradition with responsiveness to a rapidly changing world. As the decade drew to a close, the 1910s left an indelible mark on American daily life. Ordinary routines, preparing meals, tending farms, navigating city streets, raising children, remained essential, yet they were refracted through the lens of technological, social, and global change. Families navigated new responsibilities, discovered new opportunities, and adapted to a society increasingly defined by industrial efficiency, urban expansion, and international awareness. Each day balanced continuity and innovation, work and leisure, tradition and progress. Americans experienced transformation not as a single event, but as a cumulative process woven into the texture of everyday existence. Looking back, the decade can be seen as a threshold, a period when old rhythms and emerging modernity coexisted uneasily yet creatively. The lives of ordinary citizens, farmers, factory workers, homemakers, children, and immigrants formed the backbone of the nation, sustaining communities while navigating challenges that ranged from economic fluctuations to global war. Their routines reflected a remarkable capacity for adaptation, resilience, and endurance. The patterns they established, the choices they made, and the perseverance they demonstrated shaped not only the trajectory of American society, but the very definition of everyday life itself. In this, the 1910s stand as a testament to a nation both steadfast in tradition and open to the possibilities of change. Even as the world beyond America's borders demanded attention and response, ordinary life continued to anchor the nation. Streets, homes, factories, schools, and markets remained vital spaces where families, neighbors, and communities intersected. Each morning brought familiar rhythms. Stoves ignited, horses trotted, wheels rattled, children prepared for school, and adults set off to work. Yet each day also carried the subtle weight of transformation, whether in technology, politics, or cultural expectation. Life was neither static nor chaotic, but a delicate navigation between certainty and possibility, shaping the American experience in ways that would resonate far beyond the decade's close. By the end of 1919, Americans had lived through profound shifts that reshaped both perception and routine. The war had ended, yet its echoes influenced work, family, and public policy. Technological innovations, from automobiles to telephones, altered the texture of everyday life. Social movements, particularly women's suffrage, signaled long-term changes in civic participation and societal expectations. Communities had faced disease, economic pressures, and cultural integration with remarkable fortitude. Despite uncertainty, Americans maintained daily rhythms, finding continuity in chores, celebrations, worship, and recreation, anchoring their lives in patterns that bridged past and future. The ordinary days of the 1910s, though lived quietly, laid the foundation for a modern nation. The decade closed quietly, yet its impact was profound. Families carried forward lessons learned from hardship and adaptation, blending old practices with new technologies. Children grew up with both traditional instruction and exposure to modern culture. Neighborhoods and towns reflected the integration of innovation into daily routines, while cities expanded with industrial ambition and social complexity. The 1910s shaped the ordinary experience of Americans in ways that were subtle yet enduring, reminding each generation that history is measured not only in extraordinary events, but in the accumulation of everyday life, the quiet persistence of families, and the unheralded decisions that define a society in transition.